If you have never heard of the Blasket Islands, that is not a gap in your knowledge you should feel embarrassed about. Most people, including plenty of Irish people, have never heard the full story either, and the story deserves far more attention than it typically gets, because it involves one of the most unusual and quietly devastating chapters in modern Irish history. An entire island community, evacuated by choice, that left behind one of the most significant literary traditions to ever emerge from a population this small. On the 17th of November, 1953, the last 21 residents of the Great Blasket Island left their homes for the final time, ferried across to the Dingle Peninsula on the County Kerry mainland in what remains one of the most documented voluntary evacuations in Irish history. This was not a forced removal carried out against the wishes of the people living there, and that distinction matters enormously to understanding what actually happened. The evacuation came after the islanders themselves formally petitioned the Irish government for relocation, having reached the conclusion, after decades of increasing isolation, that continuing to live on the island had simply become impossible to sustain. So let me walk through exactly how a thriving island community reached that point, because the answer says as much about 20th century Ireland as it does about the island itself. The Great Blasket sits roughly 2 kilometers off the tip of the Dingle Peninsula, the westernmost inhabited point in Ireland for as long as people lived there, and one of the most exposed and weather-battered pieces of land anywhere along the Irish coast. At its population peak in the late 19th century, the island supported well over 100 residents, a community built around fishing, small-scale farming, and a fiercely self-sufficient way of life shaped entirely by the practical demands of surviving on a rock in the open Atlantic with no harbour capable of sheltering boats in genuinely bad weather. That population began declining steadily through the early 20th century, driven by the same forces reshaping rural communities right across the west of Ireland. Emigration to the United States and Britain in search of steadier income, a shrinking number of young people willing to commit to a life this physically demanding, and a slow but relentless erosion of the population base needed to sustain basic services. By the 1940s, the island's population had fallen to a fraction of its historical peak, and the practical realities of island life had become genuinely dangerous rather than simply difficult. A serious illness or medical emergency could not be reliably addressed without safe boat access to the mainland, and Atlantic weather frequently made that crossing impossible for days or weeks at a stretch. Basic supplies, fuel, and communication with the outside world all depended entirely on a boat crossing that grew less reliable as the remaining population aged and the number of able-bodied men available to make the journey continued shrinking. By 1953, the remaining 21 islanders, facing a community too small and too aged to safely sustain itself through another winter of Atlantic isolation, made the collective decision to ask the Irish government for resettlement on the mainland. The government agreed, and the evacuation that followed was carried out with the islanders' full cooperation, closing the final chapter of continuous human habitation on the Great Blasket that had likely stretched back for centuries, if not longer. Here is the part of this story that elevates it well beyond a simple, sad tale of rural depopulation though, and it is the reason the Blasket Islands deserve genuine recognition rather than a footnote in Irish emigration history. In the decades before the evacuation, this tiny, isolated island community produced 3 internationally recognized literary figures, an output entirely disproportionate to a population that never exceeded a few hundred people, even at its historical peak. Tomás or Criomhthain wrote Unsustainable, published in 1929 and translated into English as The Islandman, a first-person account of daily life on the Blasket that is now widely regarded as one of the most important works of 20th century Irish language literature, offering an unflinching, detailed record of a way of life that its own author understood was disappearing even as he wrote it down. Peig Sayers, an extraordinary oral storyteller as well as an author, produced Peig, published in 1936, a memoir that became required reading in Irish schools for generations, documenting a life shaped by poverty, loss, and the specific hardship of raising a family on an island this remote. Muiris or Súilleabháin wrote Fish Bliain ag Fas, translated as 20 Years a Growing, published in 1933, a coming-of-age account that captured island childhood with a warmth and vividness that made it one of the more widely translated works to emerge from the Irish language literary tradition of the period. 3 genuinely significant literary voices from 3 separate families, all emerging from a single small island community within the space of roughly 1 generation, is a concentration of literary output that scholars of Irish literature still find remarkable to this day. Part of the explanation lies in the island's deep-rooted oral storytelling tradition, a culture where the spoken word carried enormous social and cultural weight long before any of these figures put pen to paper, and part lies in the specific interest taken by outside linguists and folklorists in the early 20th century, who recognised the Blasket dialect and way of life as a uniquely preserved window into a form of Irish culture disappearing rapidly elsewhere, and who actively encouraged and supported several of these writers in recording their experiences before it was too late. The island today sits exactly as it was left, in the specific way that only a genuinely and permanently abandoned place can. The stone cottages that once housed the community remain standing in varying states of preservation, roofless in most cases, their walls slowly weathering back into the landscape they were built from. No permanent population has lived there since that November day in 1953, and none has attempted to return on a permanent basis since, though the island has become a modest seasonal destination for visitors during summer months, reachable by boat from Dingle when Atlantic conditions allow. Drawn largely by curiosity about the literary history and the rare experience of visiting a genuinely, completely abandoned island community. Some who study Irish coastal history and heritage have described the Great Blasket as something close to the westernmost ghost settlement in Europe, a description that captures both its geographic position at the literal edge of the continent facing directly into the open Atlantic, and its unusual status as a community that did not decline gradually into a handful of remaining residents, in the way most rural depopulation stories unfold, but instead ended cleanly and completely on a single specific day, chosen and requested by the very people who left. That combination, complete and voluntary abandonment alongside a literary legacy this significant, is genuinely rare, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The Blasket Islands do not represent a failure of a community to sustain itself so much as a community that recognised its own limits with unusual clarity, requested help before catastrophe forced the issue, and in the decades leading up to that final decision, managed to leave behind a written record of island life detailed and honest enough that the world can still read, in the islanders' own words, exactly what was lost when the last boat pulled away on that November morning. If this story of an entire community choosing to leave and the literature it left behind moved you, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who loves Irish history and literature. Let us know in the comments if you have read any of the Blasket writers.